take an intersectional approach to consent and sexual violence prevention. Intersectionality is a term and a concept created by Dr. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, and she sums it up like this. Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways in which multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that are not often understood within conventional ways of thinking about whatever social advocacy structures we have. When it comes to sexual violence prevention and consent education, we're familiar with some of the ways gender comes into play, but other aspects of our identity may affect our consent practice as well. Characteristics like race or ethnicity, queerness, body size, physical and mental ability can all impact the way that we practice consent and the risk of having our consent violated. There are many different ways to bring an intersectional approach to consent education and violence prevention. Something critical to understand is that as long as there is oppression, there will be violence, including sexual violence, because oppression is violence and oppression is a consent violation. If we look at some numbers, in Canada, Indigenous women over the age of 15 are 3.5 times more likely to experience sexual violence than non-Indigenous women. Queer people are almost 3 times as likely to experience physical or sexual violence than straight people. Women with physical disabilities are twice as likely as able-bodied women to have been sexually assaulted, and people with a cognitive disability are approximately 4 times as likely to experience violence as neurotypical folks. While statistics don't capture the nuance of personal experience, these numbers do show how living under oppressive social systems puts people at greater risk of sexual violence. Now, we often talk about power dynamics in relationships and how they affect consent. For example, if our boss makes a flirtatious comment, we might be reluctant to say, hey, that's not cool, because our boss has power over our work and our money situation. We can also talk about power imbalances that often exist between folks who hold more privileged identities and those with marginalized identities. Marginalized identities can include racialized people, which is basically people who aren't white, queer folks, disabled folks, and people in fat bodies. For those of us with marginalized identities, changing our bodies and behavior is something we're often expected to do to fit in with others, to gain access to resources like education and employment, or just to be treated with basic human decency. The good news is that there are a lot of things that can disrupt oppressive power imbalances, and we love to mess with a power imbalance. And there are a few things you can do in your classroom. One of those is to promote self-expression, encourage students to dress and groom themselves so that they're comfortable both physically and emotionally. You can support students in recognizing and honoring their own body cues and their own needs. For example, is there a way you can let a student rest if they're tired or move around if they're more restless? Also, I think everyone should be free to use the bathroom at any time. Ask students what they'd like to be called or invite them to tell you, and then use those names and pronouns accordingly. If you notice that a student is having a difficult time asserting themselves with their peers, consider checking in, ask if they'd like support, and if they say yes, find out what type of help they'd like from you. Now, if they say no, you can leave it be unless it's a situation where you have an obligation to report, but give them as much agency over the situation as possible. Now, good news, you can do these things for all of your students, but it can have an especially positive impact on kids who might be grappling with the effects of oppression. Now, consent violations aren't just sexual. I love that we've gotten to a place where many of us understand that consent and boundaries don't only come into play when there's penetrative sex, that it also applies to other sexual activities and like kissing and making out and even things like flirting. But consent and boundaries don't only come into play in a sexual situation. So here are some examples of non-sexual consent violations. Touching a Black person's hair. Asking a trans or non-binary person intrusive questions about surgeries, hormones, or their bodies. Offering someone unsolicited advice about their diet or exercise. Petting somebody's service animal. Consider offering these examples when you're talking to students about why consent is important and or how violating consent can harm people. When we discuss some of the examples of non-sexual consent violations, we can also work with students and come up with different ways that they can intervene when they see it happening. We can remind students that having a privileged identity is a tool that they can use to support others. Hit them up with a scenario, something like, if you're white and your friend starts asking the black girl in class a bunch of super personal questions about her box braids, what could you say to stop that? Most of us have a combination of privileged and marginalized identities. We can empower youth to use their power to uphold consent and disrupt oppressive violence. There are even more ways you can get intersectional with your consent education and your sexual violence prevention. You can look for resources and teaching tools that have been created by folks who hold marginalized identity. Better yet, work with Indigenous, Black, Brown, queer, fat, and disabled consent educators and bring them in so they can share their knowledge and perspective directly with your students. Include images of diverse bodies and experiences in the materials you create. Unfortunately, Black and Brown and Indigenous youth, disabled youth, and queer youth don't always get the help they need from the criminal justice system, the medical system, and even traditional counseling organizations. And in some cases, they may be subjected to even more marginalization within those systems. It's something to keep in mind when you offer your students support resources. Consider including alternative options, healing circles, restorative justice organizations, queer-specific counselors, or therapists. The Ontario Health and Physical Education curriculum states that part of equity and inclusive education means that diversity is valued and all members of the community feel safe, comfortable, and accepted. That is awesome, because feeling safe, comfortable, and accepted are three things we strive for when we practice consent. Exploring these three concepts in class can give students opportunities to think and talk about what they need to feel fully accepted, safe, and comfortable in their school. Try doing an activity based around those questions. What do you need to feel accepted? What do you need to feel safe? What do you need to feel comfortable in your body and in our school? Students in the early grades can process these ideas through drawings or movement-based activities, and so can older students. They can also journal or participate in small group discussions. And this is a great opportunity for students who have been marginalized to exercise agency and access the expertise that comes from their lived experience by thinking about what it is they want and need. You can follow up with a larger group conversation or sharing sessions so that these students have a chance to express their needs and wants to their peers if they so choose. The most important thing to remember is that intersectionality, like consent, is an ongoing practice. The information and tips I've offered today can get you started, and it's my sincere hope that you'll continue to learn so that your understanding of intersectionality gets deeper and your work to end sexual violence becomes even more powerful.